Hello, and welcome to the course of U.S. history. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. Last time we met, we looked at a changing society in Europe and how this shifting culture within Europe is going to lead to the Renaissance, a new outlook on the world. This time, we're going to look at one nation, Portugal, and its role in kicking off the Age of Exploration. Let's get to it. The Portuguese Age of Exploration begins when Prince Henry, a prince of Portugal, gets inspired by Marco Polo. Marco Polo is a explorer that had lived 100+ years before Prince Henry, but he had explored from Europe out to China and India, and then returned and told stories and wrote a book about the incredible wealth of the people that he found there, of Kublai Khan's Mongol Chinese Empire. And people were impressed, and people wanted to have greater access to this, but it was such a difficult thing to do, to travel by land to this area of the world. So Prince Henry gathers sailors and shipwrights and astronomers, and they go to a school in Portugal and they study navigation. And through this study, they learn to create the caravel, the most advanced ship of the time, combining technology from Europe and North Africa and the Near East, putting things together to create a new, stronger, faster ship that could sail in the Atlantic Ocean and could sail safely. And once they have this ship in place, they set out and they begin to explore the African coast. Because despite their proximity, Portugal is right here. Without an ability to sail safely through the Atlantic Ocean and to navigate some difficult winds and currents in this area, they'd never really explored the African coast. So, Portugal and other European nations were pretty clueless about Africa. They knew a lot about northern Africa because they could travel through the Mediterranean Sea. But all they knew was that the coast was controlled by Muslim peoples, and then below the coast there was this huge desert. They had no idea where that desert ended. Africa's a big place. I put together this scale so that you could see the relative size of the United States and the continent of Africa. It is a very large continent, and sometimes that doesn't come through as clearly as it could when you look at a map. Africa is big. Now, many in Europe at the time believed that it was about the size of Europe and that most of it was empty. They knew about the Sahara Desert, and they just assumed that once you got south of the Sahara Desert, you could just sail around Africa and you could go to India and you could go to China. Well, here's our scale again. Here's Europe, or a twisted version of Europe, fitting within Africa. It's much larger than Europe. Europe is teeny. So they don't find this small, empty continent. They find a vast continent. And they discover that once you got south of the Sahara Desert, there were developed civilizations here. It was not empty. Now, one of those civilizations, an important one, but one that doesn't feature prominently in our story because it's before the Age of Exploration, is Ghana. The Empire of Ghana existed in West Africa from 700 to about 1050 CE. Now, it began as a center of trade with North African Muslims. There are a lot of trade goods down here, and North African Muslims are very wealthy and wanted access to those goods. So they went through the Empire of Ghana, or the Kingdom of Ghana, in order to access that trade. Mali is a more significant later empire. It arises toward the tail end of Ghana, 1200 to 1500 CE. And they will spread out and cover much more territory than Ghana had. They're also very wealthy. This is a picture here of Mansa Musa. He was an emperor of Mali. And according to a recent study that was done on the most wealthy individuals in the history of the world, he came out on top as the wealthiest individual who ever lived. Now, you can pick apart that and look at a number of details and figure how they calculated it. And maybe they're right and maybe they're wrong, but he's definitely an incredibly wealthy person as the leader of this Mali empire. Mali was an Islamic kingdom. Islam had traveled through those trade routes and been adopted by West African society. And Mali had their capital at Timbuktu, a very advanced city. Now, as Portugal arrives and they start to sail down that coast of Africa, they're going to encounter Mali. And they trade with Mali. And they get a lot of goods from them. But one of the things the Portuguese do is they actually encourage, not always directly, war with the neighbors of Mali. And this is going to include the nation of Songhai, or Songhai. Now, why would the Portuguese do this? Well, we'll see in just a moment, but let's talk about the impacts of that war. From 1493 to 1528, Songhai is going to expand. They're going to wage war against Mali as well. And these two empires are fighting with each other. And as they are fighting, Songhai is going to replace Mali. And they're going to become the chief West African trade partner. And slaves become the major trade item. See, all this conflict between Mali and Songhai, every time they would raid one village of another empire, they would capture people. And if they could trade these people to the Portuguese and in exchange get weapons of war, guns, they would have a better chance at winning the war. So the Portuguese would get all this access to captured people, to slaves, in exchange for items that would help Mali and Songhai wage their wars against each other. Now, the nation of Songhai itself is going to collapse. It will eventually be defeated by a North African army out of Morocco in 1594. So those West African empires are going to collapse, and Europeans are going to eventually come in and kind of wreak some havoc in West Africa. They get very rich off of doing this. Portugal is going to grow to be very wealthy. They go from being almost an insignificant corner of Europe, far off of any regular trade routes, to becoming very wealthy and very powerful. And it's through this early control of West African trade. Some of these names for their trading regions still exist today. They named coastal areas after trade goods. Where do you go to get gold? The Gold Coast. Where do you go to get ivory? The Ivory Coast. Where do you go to get slaves? The Slave Coast. There's still a nation that exists today called Ivory Coast, which exists in the same place the Portuguese had named the Ivory Coast. These trade centers produced a lot of these goods. Portuguese got very rich off of them. In particular, the sale of African slaves. Now, this map represents something that's a bit in the future of our story, but it shows the spread and the profitability of African slave trades. Eventually, the British are going to get in on it, the Spanish, the Dutch, a lot of European nations are going to get in on the African slave trade. And they're going to be buying these slaves for a while from Portuguese slave merchants. But let's remember, this is not the main goal of the Portuguese. What they want to do is they want to sail to India, right? They want to get access to those things that Marco Polo had seen. So they continue their exploration of Africa with the intent to sail around it. And in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz is the first European to reach the southern tip of Africa and to learn that you can, in fact, sail around Africa and reach India. He named it the Cape of Good Hope because they now had reason to hope that they could sail to India. But Diaz himself does not complete that voyage. That is first done by Vasco da Gama. In 1497, a few years after Columbus, Vasco da Gama is going to sail around the southern tip of Africa. He's going to reach India. He's going to return with ships loaded with spices from India and be an extremely wealthy man. And Portugal is going to become Europe's leader in the spice trade. This is going to go very well for Portugal. But in the meantime, other European powers are going to want to have access to this as well. Next time, we're going to see what the Spanish do as we look at the voyage of Christopher Columbus, how Columbus convinces Spain to finance his voyages so that Columbus himself can sail to India and China. That's coming up next time. Thank you for joining me for the course of U.S. history. Farewell.